My name is Ann Warner, and I am the CEO of WREN, the Women's Rights and Empowerment Network. I'm joined today by Dr. Joseph von Nessen to have a conversation about the status of women in the workforce in South Carolina, particularly how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected women in the Palmetto State. Dr. von Nessen is a research economist at the Division of Research at the Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina and one of the state's leading economists. We have had the opportunity to work with him several times over the years, and we're so grateful that you could join us today, Joey. And I want to start out, if you could tell us a little bit about how things were back in early 2020 before the pandemic hit. How was South Carolina faring with respect to employment? How were women doing compared to men? And also, how were women at that time doing relative to how they had been doing in previous years and decades?
Well, generally speaking, South Carolina was doing very well going into the pandemic in early 2020. Both South Carolina and the U.S., both economies were in very good shape, and we were just coming off of a decade-long economic expansion, which is actually the longest U.S. economic expansion on record, going back to World War II, from essentially the summer of 2009 to early 2020. So by a variety of measures, including employment and wage gains, the U.S. and South Carolina economies were doing well, and South Carolina was outpacing the U.S. in terms of multiple growth metrics. So our state in particular had been doing well. Now, this had benefited both men and women over that previous decade, and we can see that especially when we look at unemployment trends over the previous decade. And we can break that down both by race and by gender. And what we find is that unlike the COVID recession, which we're going to talk about, the Great Recession in 2008 disproportionately affected men, and also black South Carolinians more so than white South Carolinians. And so as a result, we see the unemployment rates dropping more for black South Carolinians than for white South Carolinians, and more for men than for women. So for example, if we look at men, black men saw a 20 percentage point reduction in their unemployment rate, so a great improvement over the previous decade, but again, because they had been disproportionately hit. That's contrasted to white men, which saw a decline in unemployment of about 8 percentage points. And then for women, for white women, we saw a decline of about 5 percentage points and about 12 percentage points for black women. So the previous expansion benefited everyone, but it did differ based on race and gender.
Okay, and this was prior to the pandemic.
Exactly.
The statistics that you just mentioned were, where were we? How had those trends been shaping up over the last decade?
Exactly.
Can you tell us a little bit about the wage gap? That's something that we hear about, we talk about a lot, and we know that South Carolina has historically had a wide gender wage gap, wider than the national average. So can you tell us what that looked like, again, 2020 and that era before the pandemic hit?
Sure. Well, the gender wage gap, it is important to define what that really means. And it's basically a simple way that we can compare men and women in the workforce and just compare how they're doing relative to one another. And it's a way we can look at what the average male worker is earning versus the average female worker. And we find that in South Carolina, when we look at that number, it's about 73% or 73 cents on the dollar. And that was the number that we would measure going into 2020, just before the pandemic began. So basically, for every dollar that a man was earning in South Carolina, a woman was earning about 73 cents for that dollar. Now, unfortunately, that's been a fairly consistent number over the previous decade in South Carolina, meaning it hasn't moved around a whole lot. It does move around a little bit depending on the time period that we look at and how we specifically define it. But basically, it's within that 73 cent range. It's a bit better for white women, which are closer to about 80 cents on the dollar, and it's a bit worse for black women, which are about 70 cents on the dollar. But it's been very consistent over the last decade, which is a challenge going forward, because that's something that we obviously want to see improve over time. But going into the pandemic and throughout the last decade, it stayed fairly stable.
Okay, that's really helpful to hear the gender and racial breakdowns with the wage gap. Okay, so now we're getting towards the end of 2021. So can you tell us what happened during that 18-month or so time period from the spring of 2020 through the fall of 2021? How were women affected by the pandemic? is or was South Carolina in a she session?
Short answer to that question is yes, we are in a she session. I think that's a very apt description of what's been going on over the last year and a half. And we can see that in multiple ways. The most direct way to see that is to simply look at the industries that were hardest hit. And those are industries that are predominantly women, that are predominantly employing women. And so the three major sectors that were hardest hit in 2020, number one was leisure and hospitality, and accommodation and food services being the biggest piece of that. The education sector, and also healthcare. And these all have one major thing in common, and that's that they are disproportionately affected by the need to social distance, which was the cause of the ultimate cause of the pandemic, or of the recession rather. So this need to social distance obviously eliminates many restaurant jobs, and people are not going out to eat, they're not traveling at all. We see the movement more towards online and virtual learning, which affects the education sector. And then in healthcare, we see that more optional surgeries and optional medical procedures are postponed where they can be, so that affects the healthcare sector as well. All of that tied together by the need to social distance. And so again, because women are more likely to be employed in those professions, then they have been disproportionately affected, and we see that correlation that exists. The other way that we can observe this on a more regular basis is to look at weekly unemployment insurance claims data, so the rate at which we see South Carolinians filing for unemployment benefits when they are laid off. And historically speaking, when we look over the last decade and even before that, when we break that down by gender, that's been very much a 50-50 split, as you would expect, because about 50% of the population are men and women. However, if we look in 2020, beginning in 2020, for women, the percentage jumped from about 50% to 55%. So a huge bump in a very short period of time, which again, when we just think about it superficially, doesn't seem like a big change, 50 to 55, but in that historical context where you see it being so consistent over time at 50%, that major jump of 5 percentage points in such a short period is very telling, and that's a reflection of the fact that the industries hardest hit in 2020 predominantly employed women.
So that 55% unemployment claims being made by women really is a significant and meaningful difference, and something that we need to be paying attention to.
Yes, it's a major deviation from what we've seen historically, and it's a significant number. And it follows logically from the fact that the industries that were hit hardest primarily employed women. And so that shows up in a variety of metrics, but especially in those unemployment insurance claims data, which are the best metric that we have for real-time data on what's happening with the labor market and especially unemployed South Carolinians.
And also may undercount the people who are not submitting unemployment claims, who have stopped looking for work, who've left the labor force and are no longer actively seeking work. So it may even be a bigger impact on women's labor force participation than those unemployment claims can directly tell us.
Exactly. So this only counts people who have been laid off and are continuing to look for work. And we have seen people leave the labor force and women leave the labor force at fairly high rates. And in general, historically speaking, women have lower labor force participation rates relative to men, and that's another challenge that South Carolina faces going forward, is elevating that labor force participation rate, given that it has retracted further during the pandemic. So both pieces are very important as we move forward.
So let's talk about some of the reasons why women have left the workforce. You have already alluded to some of the reasons. The jobs may have been cut in certain sectors, but what are sort of holistically some of the reasons that you're able to tell from the data that's available?
Major reasons is that women tend to be the primary caregiver in their families, and so that has, over the last year and a half, required them to leave the labor force at higher rates because of the need to social distance, and of course daycares have been closed, thinking about children now, and education has been more virtual, and so that requires parental supervision. And again, if women are more likely to serve in that primary child care role, then they're going to be disproportionately affected there as well. And that's across all industry sectors. So that's not just looking at those three that we talked about, education, healthcare, leisure, and hospitality, but across all sectors, women are more likely to cut back or to exit the labor force because of those family responsibilities that they are more likely to take on. So that's been a primary factor as well.
And some of those challenges that working women had and are having during the pandemic existed before as well. That caregiving burden is a big deal, and often work isn't necessarily set up to allow women or other caregivers to be able to balance those different responsibilities. Do you think that the conditions of work, some of the things, the difference in wages, lack of access to paid leave, lack of access to healthcare insurance, childcare, et cetera, some of those things that were existing as challenges before the pandemic have been exacerbated by the pandemic?
Yes, and we can see this when we look at women going back into the labor force and going back to work, and the struggles to meet those challenges. If they're looking at healthcare or primary, they are the primary care provider in the family, then they are going to need more flexibility, and they may need to work from home. And many of these positions that were lost over the last year, that's simply not an option for a lot of these jobs. So if we think about healthcare, if you're treating patients, or if you're in the classroom, or if you are working at a restaurant, social distancing is really not an option for those jobs. So that creates a challenge if you're trying to balance family priorities with your job or a potential opportunity to go back to work.
Mm-hmm. We talked about the gender wage gap and what that looked like prior to the spring of 2020 when the pandemic hit. What do we know about wages and how they've been different for women and men since the pandemic begun? Has there been an impact in either direction on that gender wage gap?
Well, the gender wage gap has remained fairly consistent up through 2020, so again, about 73 cents on the dollar. We don't have good state level data for what's been happening since then, so we will find out more about what happens in 2020 and 2021 in the coming months. But we do know that it has been fairly stable over the previous decade, which again, not a whole lot of fluctuation there, and that it does vary based on race as well. Again, with white women doing a bit better, about 80 cents on the dollar, and black women slightly worse than that average, about 70 cents on the dollar.
Okay. Let's talk about the impact on industry a little bit more, which you talked about previously. But what are the industries that have recovered, and what are the industries that are still struggling to recover?
Well, this goes back to why the term she-cession really is a good fit for the phenomenon that's happening now, because we mentioned the three major sectors that had driven the recession itself in terms of the ones that saw the most employment losses, and how those were primarily employing a female workforce. But if we look at the industries that have recovered, there are four major sectors that have higher employment levels today than they had back in February of 2020. So they have more than fully recovered. But only one of those four is predominantly employing women, and that's the education sector, which has fully recovered. The other three are construction, which we all know housing has had a great year and a half, so housing is doing very well. That's completely recovered. The logistics sector, which represents transportation, distribution, and warehousing. So all those jobs that have been needed to service all of the online ordering we've been doing as we've been staying home. So from Amazon and Walmart and so forth. So that industry is fully recovered. And then retail trade itself is fully recovered. But none of those three, all three of those are more male dominated than female dominated. And so again, we see this mismatch between the industries that saw a significant decline in 2020 are not the ones that are recovering at the same rate. So women continue to be more likely to be unemployed in 2021 in South Carolina than men are.
Okay. We're hearing a lot about the labor shortage now, and would love for you to break that down. What does the labor shortage mean, and how are women particularly relevant to helping us to address that labor shortage?
Well, the labor shortage, economists like to talk, I should stop and say, economists like to talk about supply and demand and boil everything down to supply and demand, and so you hear that all the time, and the labor shortage really is no different. So here we're talking about a major mismatch between labor supply and labor demand, or the need for workers. And so we can see that very clearly, because if we look at consumer demand, it has come back significantly in 2021. And in fact, overall consumer spending now is about 10% higher than it was in February of 2020 when the pandemic began. So demand looks really good from a state perspective and nationally. but employment is still down nationally about 3%, in South Carolina about 2%. So that's a major mismatch between overall demand, consumer demand, and the labor supply to satisfy that demand. And so as a result, we see this shortage that is in part based on the additional consumer demand that has come back faster than employment has recovered. And then the second element is when we look at the source of the labor shortage itself. Why is employment down? And the biggest single reason is that baby boomers have actually retired in significant numbers since the pandemic began in 2020. And that's baby boomers retiring represents about 50% or about half of the reduction in the labor force that we've seen nationally. And that's a permanent shift. So that means that this labor shortage is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. And given that women are more likely to be unemployed now than men, especially in South Carolina, that means it's more important now than ever to focus on how we can get women back into the workforce, employed again, because this labor shortage, the only way it can be solved is by bringing women back into the labor force and by them becoming employed again.
So women are truly at the center of the economic recovery
Yes.
in South Carolina.
100%, because women are more likely to be unemployed right now. We're more likely to be affected. And so this labor shortage that we see can only be solved by having more women in the workforce. And so that has to be a priority going forward.
What are some of the ways that you think we might be able to get towards solving that labor shortage? What do employers and policymakers need to keep in mind as they're thinking about ways to engage women in the jobs where they really need talent?
Well, I think this is really a unique opportunity to communicate both to employers and to workers, and to women in particular, about what they can do now. Because this labor shortage provides an opportunity, number one, to communicate to employers how to better recruit workers, to provide additional incentives, whether that's higher wages or additional flexibility or additional health care benefits, whatever that is. Employers are really desperate to hire workers. They're doing everything they can to provide additional incentives and resources to potential employees. And so that opens up a way for, or an opportunity for individuals to go and inform these employers, this is what women are looking for, this is what they need, this is how you attract them into the workplace. And employers will respond to that, and that can provide some additional advantages in the workplace from what the employers can do there. Then from the perspective of the workers themselves, the other thing that they need to be recognizing is this is a once-in-a-generation job market. This is the best job market that we've seen in a number of years. And so that means that workers, and women in particular, have more bargaining power than perhaps they've ever had, certainly in recent history. And so that gives them the opportunity to make more requests and to be more choosy about which jobs they want, and to be able to communicate what their needs are as well. So we can see coming at this from both directions, both from the employer and from the worker side, and we need to communicate to both participants in the labor market about what they can both be doing better in order to meet the labor needs that we have.
Well, it sounds like we have an opportunity here with all the challenges over the last year and a half. It's an opportunity to really think about how to make South Carolina work for women, and to ensure that the working conditions allow women to thrive in the workforce. Do you see an opportunity here for us to not only catch up with ground that has been perhaps lost, but actually for South Carolina to be a leader in terms of closing some of these gender gaps and creating a more equitable and resilient workforce for everyone in our state?
Yes, and I think there are two steps to that strategy, or to forming a strategy, two things to keep in mind. One is to help women and all South Carolinians who are currently unemployed, and to return them to the workforce, and to create strategies for how to proactively do that in an effective manner. And then secondly, to work towards increasing the labor force participation rate itself. As we talked about before, that tends to be lower for women than it is for men across the U.S. and in South Carolina. So what do we need to be doing in order to move more women from off the sidelines and back into the labor force itself? So those are two separate but important and related strategies: moving people off the sidelines back into the labor force so that they're interested in going back to work, and also moving people who are unemployed and actively seeking employment, making sure that they are able to move into the workforce and attain employment as well.
This is really an economic imperative for South Carolina.
Absolutely, yes. More so now than ever, because this labor force shortage is a defining challenge for South Carolina for the next decade at minimum. And that's because South Carolina, it's more of an acute problem here than it is in the U.S. because we have an older population overall, and our in-migration is primarily among people who are over 55, which is great news for from a business perspective in terms of demand. We see people that are looking to retire to South Carolina. South Carolina offers all sorts of positive amenities for retirees coming into the state. It's great news for the demand overall for employers, but it doesn't help us solve our labor shortage. Because we're not seeing younger people necessarily comprising the bulk of that growth. And so that means this labor shortage, which exists across the country, is more acute in South Carolina, which means it's more important than ever to encourage labor force participation rates, to encourage ways to increase that, and to move people back to a situation where they are all employed.
Sounds like this is the moment for women in South Carolina.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Joey, for helping us to understand these trends and how they're affecting people of different gender and racial identities differently in South Carolina. And we started to talk today about the why and where we are. And what's next, I think, is talking about the how.
Yes.
And we have a great opportunity, as you've said. It's clear that if women aren't thriving, South Carolina isn't thriving. Our households depend on women to be healthy and economically well off, and our economic growth as a state depends on women being able to work, come to work, be healthy at work, stay at work, be successful. So it really is an opportunity and a challenge. And we at WREN are looking forward to convening business leaders and policymakers in 2022 to talk more about the why and, more importantly, I think, the how. How do we get from where we are to where we could be? So we will be looking forward to convening you again, Joey, as well as some leaders from the business and policy community to talk about what's next. And folks can find more information out about Joey's report and about WREN's initiative on our website, scwren.org. That's scwren.org. Thank you so much again, Joey, for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Ann.
It was great having you. Thank you so much.